Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our event today, Returning to Sport Sustainably Post-COVID. It's great to see you all here. Thanks so much for making the time this lunchtime to come along to the event. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to BASIS, the British Association for Sustainable Sport, for helping us to run this event today. My name is Raf Nicholson, and I'm a senior lecturer in sport and sustainability in the Sport and Physical Activity Research Centre at Portsmouth University. So sustainability is an important part of my job title and description. And I'm particularly interested in sport and social sustainability. My current research, which I will talk about a little bit later, is concerned with the governance of sport and how we run sport in a way that's more equitable and diverse, and therefore more sustainable. So why have we at the Sport and Physical Activity Research Centre at Portsmouth University organised this event? Well, the aim of today's event is to bring together practitioners and academics working in the field of sport and sustainability to discuss key issues and best practice as we kind of slowly emerge from lockdown. And I'm delighted to see from the sign-up list on Eventbrite that we've got a really good mix of academics and practitioners in the Zoom room. As somebody who works as an academic, my feeling is that we often do great research, but we struggle perhaps sometimes to reach practitioners and to kind of feed into policy and practice outside of the university environment. So what I'm hoping that today's event will allow us to do is to build some networks and to kind of talk to and share with each other as academics and practitioners. I've just got a few slides that I'm going to quickly share. So hopefully everyone can see those okay. So do follow us at the Sport and Physical Activity Research Centre on Twitter at the USpark, first of all, just to tell you a little bit about the centre. We study sport at all levels, from mega events to informal leisure. We're a multidisciplinary centre combining scholars from a range of academic disciplines, humanities, social sciences, sports science and health from across Portsmouth University. And our aim is to develop knowledge that can contribute towards policy in sport, physical activity, health and well-being, to encourage healthy lifestyles, to impact practice in public and private organisations, to engage the public and, generally speaking, to contribute towards progressive societal change. Spark is closely aligned with the Department of Sport and Event Management at Portsmouth University, and there are three kind of overlapping strands to our research. We look at sport, health and well-being, and within that, social inequalities, social exclusion, empowerment through sport, social media and digital cultures, physical activity and emotional well-being across the lifespan. There's a behavioural, applied and coaching sciences element to what we do in the department. So we look at behavioural change, exercise and sport participation across the lifespan. We look at support for elite sports performance, talent identification and how to develop elite talent, disability, sport and physical activity, lifestyle management and athlete well-being, injuries and illness. And then the third strand is policy management and development. So we also look at international development, sport policy, tourism, leisure and sports mega events, consumerism and fandom, and organisations, corporate social responsibility and marketing. And what we're looking to do in the department and in the centre is produce research which is meaningful and speaks to broader social, economic and sporting challenges. And one of those challenges is sustainability. Sustainability is at the heart of life at Portsmouth University. The UN Sustainable Development Goals underpin our university strategy, BU 2025, and we aim to enrich society by having a significant impact on the global challenges as set out in those UN goals. We're looking to align our curriculum and to maximise research opportunities in order to contribute innovatively to tackle the climate crisis in its broad scope across all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have a climate and ecological crisis action plan in place, and our target is to achieve net zero emissions by 2030-31. And we're ranked in the top 7% of universities across the world in terms of impact rankings for our contribution to the UN SDGs. And in May 2020, we formed a sustainability academic network, a group that's kind of responsible for supporting and leading action to embed sustainability into education, practice and research at Bournemouth University. So a few examples of research projects which we're undertaking here at Bournemouth University or have recently conducted here in the Spark Centre. The first that I wanted to mention is the Storm Break project, which is about mental health interventions in primary schools. And there's a URL on the screen. I'll also be putting some relevant URLs in the chat, in the Zoom chat in a minute. But Storm Break looks to embed mentally healthy movement in every classroom across the UK as a way of promoting positive mental health in children. And the aim is to equip teachers to be able to support children through movement, thus engaging them in positive mental health, helping a future generation build resilience and develop effective self-care. That's obviously aligned with Sustainable Development Goal number 3, good health and well-being. The second piece of research that I wanted to mention was a project that we did which looked at it asked critical questions about the relationship between Paralympic coverage, especially that from Rio 2016, and the experiences of daily life for people in the UK with disabilities. Audience data alongside national survey results helped explore how the general public understand disability as represented through para-sport coverage. And these findings are being used to inform the coverage of future Paralympics to ensure that the coverage is inclusive and contributes towards progressive societal change. And this project was really aligned with SDG number 10, reduced inequalities. And then I couldn't resist telling you about my current research, which looks at sport governance. I've entitled it here, The Past is Female. So overall, the research is aiming to try and help overcome the issue of the underrepresentation of women in contemporary sport governance. But I'm a historian by background, so I'm kind of looking backwards, investigating the 10 years between 1990 and 2000, when the landscape of British sport changed fundamentally. During this period, almost all women's sports that had previously been administered separately to their male counterparts merged with the men's governing bodies, thanks to a directive from what was then the Sports Council, what's now UK Sport. And these mergers caused many women to leave sport governance. They created kind of widespread feelings of disempowerment, with some women feeling that they'd been kind of pushed out of existing governance roles. And I'm actually going and interviewing some of those women about why they left governance at this time. And I hope that this research will enable us to understand why we've ended up in our current situation, where some women don't really feel much ownership of sport or feel any desire to become involved in running it. So I'm aiming to shed light onto how national governing bodies of sport and sporting organisations at all levels really might seek to address these kind of diversity issues. So of course, more equitable and diverse governance structures are a key aspect of social sustainability, and the research speaks in particular to 2 of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 5, gender equality, and Goal 10, reduced inequalities. So if any of these pieces of research have particularly caught your attention, I've included links on the slide, and I'll also post links in the chat. And do feel free to contact me after we wrap up today to chat further. So this is what the rest of today's event is going to look like. I'm going to stop talking very soon, and we're going to have 3 excellent speakers, and then we're going to wrap up with 30-35 minutes of Q&A roundtable discussion. So in terms of just overall to think about what we're trying to achieve from today's event, well, I think at Spark, we feel that perhaps some of our research activities have been difficult to conduct, but also to share during the pandemic. And we hope that this event can signal something of a revival. In particular, we're looking to run more events focused around sustainability. As I've said, that's a kind of key focus of Bournemouth University as an institution. We'd love to conduct more research here at Bournemouth into sport and sustainability, and we want to carry out research, I suppose, which is useful to practitioners. So we'd love to hear from you or work with you to find out what would be useful. We'd like to run more lunchtime seminars like this one, focused around themes which are kind of both useful and meaningful to both academics and practitioners. And we'll follow up with you after the event to check that you're okay, or to check whether you're okay with being contacted about future BU Spark events. But crucially, today is about, I think, generating a conversation around this really, really key area of sustainability, which of course affects all of us and every single sport. And I will be sharing the recording of the event afterwards. It will be available on our new Spark YouTube channel. Okay, that's enough from me for now. I'm just going to introduce our first speaker of today, and I'm delighted to welcome Russell Seymour, who is the CEO of BASIS, the British Association for Sustainable Sport. Russell Seymour is a pioneer in sustainability and sport in the UK, with an academic background with degrees in ecology, environmental sciences and biodiversity management. He started work in the sports sector through a convoluted career path, but soon realised that the sports sector had significant environmental impacts, was being impacted by environmental changes, and importantly, had an opportunity to raise awareness as a trusted non-partisan ambassador by using the powerful influence of sport on participants and fans. Working at Lord's Cricket Ground as the first sustainability manager at a major UK sports venue, Russell integrated sustainability principles into business functions across the venue. And with this in mind, he set up BASIS in 2010 with the intention of bringing together like-minded individuals at all levels of sport to share ideas, experiences and strategies around sustainability. And he became the chief executive of BASIS in 2018. He's also a visiting lecturer in sports management at Loughborough University and in event management at the University of Greenwich. He sits on the British Standards Committee on Sustainable Consumption and Production, and he's a member of the advisory board for the Sport Ecology Group. And he was presented with the London 2012 Sustainability Ambassadors Award for his contribution towards the sustainable Olympic and Paralympic Games. So I'll hand over to you now, Russ. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thanks, Raf, for the introduction. Hopefully you can see my slides. So thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event. Thanks to Spark and to Raf in particular. I'm very happy that BASIS could effectively co-promote this event as well. So I'm going to talk about this rather long titled document that we've produced, One World, One Team, One Chance. It's a 10-point plan for how we feel British sport can actually come back in a more resilient and more sustainable way from the lockdown, from the COVID pandemic lockdown. So just quickly, a quick introduction to BASIS. We're a national body. We want to integrate sustainable development principles into sport management through education, through encouraging sport. My slide's changing. There we go. Education, sharing best practice, encouraging, facilitating collaboration, using the influence of sport to inform the public. We don't actually use sport as a tool to talk about sustainable development issues. Sport is happening and sport is positive and sport is good, but we then have to manage those issues. So we want to use sport as a mechanism to talk about it. So we're not actually using sport as the tool as such. So it's slightly different to some other areas, but sport is happening and we can talk about sustainability issues through sport rather than the other way around. We want to advocate and represent the sports sector to government, and we're also act as a liaison between our members and the media. Some members feel they might be criticised if they make a statement in one area but not doing so well in another. You know, if they talk about recycling on one hand but then they're taking too many flights. So to avoid that criticism, we try and liaise between our members and the media as well. So we've got quite a wide range of activities we try to do. In terms of this particular study, this particular report, very early on in the first lockdown, so way back in sort of April of last year, we saw this could potentially be a turning point. We tried to get some positives out there. At the time, we were probably thinking this was going to be 3, 4, maybe 5 months of inactivity. Obviously, it's turned into something significantly longer, and sport has come back in different ways at different times with different crowd levels, different participation rates, etc. We're now heading back into something like normality. But early on, we recognized this can actually be a turning point. Very early on in the lockdown, people started talking about the sky being bluer and the birds singing, all these kind of almost sort of romantic ideas came out, but there's a greater awareness around the environment in particular. So we decided to run a survey, and it lasted from June, lasted till November, slightly longer than we'd expected, but we're engaging more and more people throughout. So the sorts of questions we asked, we wanted to know what people were already doing. So what issues are relevant to your organisation? Have you already felt some of the impacts, for example, of climate change? And have you already included sustainability issues in your risk assessment? So those kind of questions. But then we also wanted to look forward. What do you think the barriers are to you changing your operations? And do you need any help to make those changes so we could plan for the future? And crucially, we asked a reasonably simple question in terms of what the answer could be, but should sport actually build back from the COVID-19 pandemic in a more resilient and environmentally sustainable way? We intentionally put in the word resilient alongside sustainability, just because sustainability kind of has multiple meanings and can be a bit scary. People don't really know what sustainability means, but resilience really offers that firm foundation. So we're intentionally using those terms together. Just a couple of quick caveats on what I'm about to report back to you. The final report has been produced. We've got the document. It's been available probably for a couple of months now, but it's currently embargoed from our end. So I'm not going to give you the full recommendations and commitments that we've made, but I'm going to give you a good flavour and as much of the detail as I feel I can. The reason for this is we're trying to engage with what I'll simply call sort of the major players in sport at the moment. So everybody on this call will probably understand that I'm talking about people like DCMS, UK Sport England. There's very little value in us producing a report with the potential that some of the major players can actually either not engage with it or feel that it's unworkable or whatever. So the intention for us is to try and engage with them first. We're also talking about major governing bodies and try and get them on board before we go out to the wider public. So we're expecting that to happen in fairly short order. But we're in discussions at the moment. So it has been distributed to some people on that understanding that the content is currently embargoed. So the original respondents have received it, basis members and partners have received it, and those key players that I've just mentioned have received the document, and we're getting feedback on it. And we're actually conducting some follow-up research. We're working with the University of Edinburgh on that at the moment to see if anything has changed. And now that we're moving out of lockdown, has anything already happened? Have attitudes changed? Is there really still an opportunity to come out of this in a more environmentally sustainable way? I'm going to run through some of the conclusions before I actually give you some of the actual results, which I know is an odd way around of doing it, but hopefully this works. So the sector definitely understand that there is a need to do something about the environmental challenge. It's become very clear that there are issues that we need to deal with. And probably to a lesser extent that environment, social and economic issues are all linked. You have to run your business in a viable way, so economic issues kind of sit there anyway. Sport has always been, or for quite a while, has been pretty good at social issues. Now, there are certain things that sport hasn't been good at, but generally speaking, most professional clubs will have some kind of outreach program to the community, etc. So there's some level of engagement around social, but sports has been quite poor around environmental. We're trying to emphasize that all these three things are actually linked together. Even though there's a level of understanding, sustainability issues have not become organisational priorities. And we're hoping that our document, getting support for the document and the commitments that we make in there and the recommendations, they will become organisational priorities. So the sector wants change. They want to embrace sustainability, but what the sector feels it's lacking is knowledge, resources, and leadership around these areas. So we've produced a report to try and address that, and it's a 10-point plan that consists of 5 commitments from us and 5 recommendations to the sector. Now, we're still going to need to get some level of funding, some level of organisation around this, and some of the commitments are quite general. The language you're about to see, and I'll present them to you now, but the language is quite general, and that's intentional because we want to work with the sector. We don't just want to say, this is the way BASIS says you have to do this. We want to work with the sector. But hopefully the points are clear, but there's an element of needing to discuss and actually push forward to implement these commitments and recommendations. So I'm going to give you a narrative running through the results, and within that narrative I'll present the commitments and the recommendations as they came up. So we had a wide range of respondents from suppliers, governing bodies, professional clubs, through to event organisers, even players and athletes, academics, and one international federation came through as well. There was strong support for sustainability in sport. In fact, there was unanimous support. Everybody said this is important. We've got to do something about this. We've got to make our operations more sustainable. Now, we're aware there's possible bias in our sample. We tried to put it out as widely as we could through different organisations, but probably the majority of people responding came from our own mailing list. So there's a selection bias there. This probably wouldn't get published in an academic journal. So I'm going to say that rather at the beginning. But because of the breadth of the respondents we had, we feel that this is fairly representative, or at least it gives us a good breadth of response. So it's a significant report. And as far as we know, it's the largest survey of its type, possibly arguably the only survey that we're aware of, but it gets a good wide sample size of different types of people responding to the study. So the respondents saw that it was essential to build back better from COVID-19. We needed to do this. We asked, the question was, you know, do you think it's necessary? Please give yes or no, and then give a free text answer to explain. Only one person didn't respond yes. That person didn't actually respond no. They simply said, this is going to cost a lot of money. I know the individual, that's the sort of response that that person would actually give. But in terms of the free text, the key words, at least from memory, it was about at least 3/4, 75 to 80% of people used one or more of these three key words. Either there's an opportunity, we have a responsibility, or there's a necessity. So the themes were there, and these are quite powerful words to say that we need to be doing something from within the sport industry, from within the sport sector. So our first commitment is that we should convene and lead a coalition of organisations to improve sustainability in the sports sector. Our first recommendation is that there should be a clear commitment for the UK to become a world leader in hosting sustainable international sporting events. We asked people if they're already feeling the impacts of climate change, and nearly 3/4 have said they are already feeling these impacts, and that's quite a big proportion. But most of these organisations, well over 2/3, about a third, are not including sustainability in their risk assessments, and more than half, are not discussing sustainability at top level, at their board level. So our second commitment is that we'll develop guidance and specialist consultancy if needed for executives, for operational staff at these clubs, venues and governing bodies to address that knowledge gap. We're recommending that the Code for Sports Governance includes sustainability issues, environmental sustainability issues, alongside other policies, process and risk. Now, we're aware that the Code for Sports Governance has been revised recently. My understanding is it's due sort of final approval, or relatively quick, in relatively short order. It should be coming out. It's just waiting for final approval. So we're not going to influence this particular revision, but we need some kind of mechanism to make sure that environmental sustainability is implemented into proper governance policies. Our third recommendation is that we'll do a comprehensive risk analysis across all of sport to assess sport's vulnerability to climate change, biodiversity loss, other sustainability issues, with recommendations as to how this then impacts sport. We asked about the barriers and the potential solutions that people saw. And again, it came down to some key words. It's knowledge, it's funding. There's still a perception that this is going to be expensive. It's about giving incentives. It's about having strong policies and the understanding this is a long-term policy, a long-term direction, and it's about providing leadership. So our commitments and recommendations to address those issues. We commit to provide sustainability training throughout the sector, facilitating this peer-to-peer learning, making sure best practice is put out there. Our fourth commitment is we'll set and communicate clear principles and practices and targets for our clubs, our venues, our governing bodies, and then make sure that we've got a way of actually certifying and reporting on that progress. Our fifth and final commitment from our perspective, from what basis we'll deliver, is that we'll advocate for sport to develop national policies, legislation, so go to government and talk about what sport actually needs, and then we'll communicate those back to the sport industry about new policies, legislation, and the guidance that the sector actually needs. Our fourth recommendation is that we'll, excuse me, is that there should be support under the government's green recovery plans, including access to capital funds from the National Infrastructure Bank. And linked to that is that any other capital investment or funding, whatever source that comes through, whether it's lottery funding, whether it's from the governing bodies, there should be a requirement that is somehow linked to enhanced sustainability initiatives, to be decided exactly how that works, but there should be some kind of reporting back mechanism that improvements are being made in terms of impacts. In terms of our delivery position, I've already explained, we're currently in discussions with some of the major players in this area. We're targeting some kind of summit event in September to draw everybody together and discuss and push forward on this, with an aim that something will come up either at or just before COP26. And we're committed to this 2022 and beyond. This is a long-term commitment. It's going to take some time to deliver, and we'd be very happy to work collaboratively with others, whether that's academics that are on this call, whether it's clubs, governing bodies also on this call. So very happy for you to get in touch to discuss moving forward. A brief sort of few word summary of the commitments that we have and the recommendations that we've made, but I think I went slightly over my time, so perhaps I should hand back over to Raf, but looking forward to the conversation afterwards.
Great, thank you so much, Russ. Really interesting to hear more about that report. As I did say earlier, do feel free to put questions to Russ in the chat, and we'll return to them at the end once we've heard from our next two speakers. So our next speaker is Dr. Beth Clarkson. She's a senior lecturer in sport management and development at the University of Portsmouth, and her research interests centre on three broad areas and their intersections: leadership, governance, and equality, diversity and inclusion. And her research is featured in international and national media, and she's written media articles for The Conversation. Her research has also been recognised internationally. Most recently, she won the 2020 Celia Brackenridge International Research Award for Excellence in Scholarship on Women in Sport. So delighted to have you with us today, Beth, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Raf. Real. Yeah, thanks, Raf, for inviting me to come and speak with you today about some of the research that I've been leading that looks at the impact of COVID-19 on women's sport. So I suppose, first of all, sustainability can mean obviously two things. It could mean looking at ecological balance in the environment, but also about something being maintained and being able to be maintained. And that's essentially where I'm coming from with women's sport. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the research that I've been leading, and then based off of that, suggest some strategies that governing bodies could use to encourage sustainability of women's sport in a post-COVID world. Unfortunately, one of my collaborators who's based at Bournemouth University, Dr. Keith Parry, can't make it today, so it'll just be me presenting, but that's my connection with Bournemouth University. So, of course, COVID-19 pandemic has significantly disrupted lives globally, and really presents an unprecedented and complex challenge for nations in their efforts to preserve all aspects of our society. And when we saw the prioritisation of sport coming back to our TV schedules, that really highlighted what a crucial aspect of society that sport is. But the global economic downturn that was caused by the pandemic also exposed gender inequalities. So women were disproportionately affected by unpaid care, by housework, by economic hardship, and that has implications for gender equality. And I suppose, like other fundamental aspects of society, sport has not been immune to those gendered effects as well. So while governing bodies have an ethical and a social responsibility to advance gender equality, they've also got to consider the pandemic's economic impact and how those finite resources are going to be distributed. So I'm going to take you through in detail what's happened in some key sports in the UK to show that COVID-19 has prompted a wide range of responses by governing bodies as they juggle economic, ethical and social pressures. I'm going to first start with football. That's the sport that we've conducted research in. There hasn't been research in rugby, cricket or in golf that I'm going to talk about to the best of my knowledge. So I'm going to detail some of the events that happened as per a book chapter that we have coming out on that as well. So when the pandemic first caused mass suspension of sport across the world, Keith, myself and two other authors, Stacey Pope and Alex Colvin, who've also worked or published in women's football, really reflected upon the threat and uncertainty that was facing elite women's football in England. And we identified some threats relating to governance and funding of the sport, as well as consequences for player well-being. So an economic concern here is the way that women's clubs are connected to men's parent clubs. Now, this was part of the FA's strategic, and the FA being the governing body there, their strategic plan for women's game, where the teams were encouraged to become a secondary side under the umbrella of men's professional club. So that meant they were now reliant on funding and access to resources and facilities. And essentially, women's football has been beholden to the financial health and stability or perhaps instability of elite men's football. And there have been numerous examples where women's teams have unfortunately been cut adrift from men's clubs when that club becomes in debt or has been relegated. There's instances where women players were left jobless and even homeless. We can look to Charlton, Notts County. AFC Fylde looked to be the first sort of casualty of COVID-19 when the club announced a restructure in May and decided to disband their women's team. But that decision was actually reversed 4 weeks later because there was significant pressure from the media and from the women's football community. So I suppose that example really reinforces the real threat facing elite women's football, but also the power that the advocacy can have as well. The women's game is also reliant on the continued financial support of the governing body, the FA. They in part fund the game and provide teams with financial support. They've said when the pandemic happened that grassroots football and the women's game were key strategic priorities and were not going to be focus of cuts. They were looking, they said that the pandemic had cost about 150 million. But later on, a leaked report showed that grassroots football was going to be cut 22 million across 4 years. So historically, funding has been cut to the women's game in financially turbulent times. So this has caused great concern to the community and uncertainty. And then lastly, while we have players in the top tier of English women's football who have full-time contracts, in the second tier and below, it operates on a part-time basis where women footballers top up their income through part-time or full-time roles outside of football. And there are a lot of anxieties about the ongoing viability of those roles in light of the pandemic, in light of furlough, in light of redundancies. A recent FIFPro report suggested that 47% of women players have had their wages cut or suspended, and accounts of depression have doubled in footballers. So quite a few concerns there. We then looked to follow this up by doing some empirical research, and we compared the responses of 3 national governing bodies in football, so 3 national FAs, in the first 6 months of the pandemic. So we looked at England with the FA, who managed the WSL. We looked in the USA, who is jointly managed by US Soccer and the NWSL, the league there. And then we looked in Australia and the FFA, who govern women's football there. And what we found was in England, there was a 2-month interval between the pandemic and the suspension of women's football and communication about how the season was going to be resolved. Essentially, the focus was on Project Restart and the Men's Premier League. In the USA, in that same time period, we saw the launch of a new tournament, the Challenge Cup, that had COVID measures in place. They had commercial and broadcasting partners. So in the same time frame, a very different story. In Australia, the season schedule is slightly different in the year. So the season actually ended in March, but in our analysed time period, there was no communication on how the pandemic might affect the resumption of the W League. And that was despite the fact that there was a lot of attention on the FFA, where Australia won the bid to become a joint host nation of the 2023 Women's World Cup as well. I'm going to talk about our recommendations and strategies for sustainability related to that piece of research at the end. So I'll take you through some of the other sports to show you what's happened during the course of the pandemic. As I've said, there's not some clear empirical research that has been done yet on this, and that's part of the challenge is to be able to do that. So in rugby, internationally, the Women's Six Nation was suspended, as was the men's version, but differentially, it was abandoned, and the inherent amateur status of the competition meant that it was impossible to conclude. That was said by the organisers. In rugby union, the women's Premier 15 competition, the season was declared null and void. In comparison, the men's premiership was completed with testing in place. In rugby league, women's competition was not communicated for 5 months. In the end, the NRL decided to cancel that season and restrict the women's teams to local friendlies and restricted travel. When they communicated that, the men's competition had already resumed. And then additional uncertainty happened with Tyrrell's, where they ended their sponsorship of the Premier 15s. So when that got, they decided not to resume that. So some uncertainty there in rugby. In cricket, the ECB, the governing body, predicted that there would be a £380 million shortfall, and they openly stated that their commercially driven men's cricket would take priority in order for more sustainable women's game to take place over the coming years. Now, unfortunate sort of scheduling problems with getting international teams to certain locations meant that women's international cricket resumed 3 months after men. And in addition to that, in the international stage, the World Cup was delayed to 2022, and there were some concerns by players at the time in England and Wales over how the governing bodies would react to that if the strategic need had been delayed for preparation for that team. It's also meant that there are going to be 3 major tournaments scheduled for 2022. In domestic cricket, the 100 competition, which has men and women players within it in local geographic clubs, those women's contracts were actually maintained, whereas the men took a 25% pay cut in order to make sure that competition went ahead. Obviously, the women's contracts were substantially less than the men's contracts, just to caveat that. But what they did also do was create an additional domestic competition for women cricketers, the Rachel Hayhoe Flint Trophy, and that allowed them to get playing again. And then my last sport to tell you about it is golf. So the Ladies European Tour, after the suspension, returned 2 months after the men's tour. And upon seeing the lack of opportunities for women golfers, Justin Rose, who's a prolific male golfer, and his wife got on board to organise a new mini tour. And their involvement attracted commercial sponsors. It gave the opportunity for professional women golfers to play. And as a result of their involvement, a further 7 additional tournament events were added to the tour. And it generated enough media interest to warrant a highlight show. So in this example here, we can show how allies of women's sport can really change and evolve the opportunities for women's, well, for sportswomen in the country. So I said I would return to the conversation of sustainability and strategies towards that. So just revisit that study that I mentioned at the start, where we looked at 3 different FAs and what their differences in the first 6 months really told us and what lessons we could learn. So we found that communication here was so vital with the community to really allay any worries that they had about the future of women's sport. That active communication in the US really showed and had some differences there with the way, for instance, that in Australia there was no communication for that 6-month period. Gathering support from health and government officials was important in the Challenge Cup. It was all based in Utah. They had the governor's approval. They had a bubble, so everyone was in one location, and that cooperation allowed them to run that tournament. They had commercial and broadcasting partners in place, and that's really helped drive revenue. Since we've done this research, we've obviously seen some interesting developments in domestic and international women's football in this country with regards to broadcasting, and some monumental partnerships that have been struck. So that's a great thing to see. But interestingly, what we felt was that the interests of women's football were actually best served when the responsibility for the league didn't solely rest with the National FA. And that was really the difference between the US governing structure and the Australian and English structure, where the NWSL operated separately and had some financial support as opposed to the Football Association governing. But to go a little bit more broadly now and think about some key strategies that we could suggest based on some of the research that we've conducted, and thinking a bit more broadly about the events of some other sports as well. Communication here is vital where there might be a short-term hit to women's sport. So this is something that cricket that they've done very well, where it was clear what was going to happen and why, and then there have been strategies in terms of domestic competitions, etc., to really reinforce that the sport is not forgotten, the women's game is not forgotten. There's also been opportunities to revise scheduling. And this could create festivals of women's sport and really act as a catalyst. So again, in cricket, I mentioned 3 major tournaments in 2022. We saw in football with the FIFA Women's World Cup how much that was a catalyst for the sport across the world. And hopefully in women's cricket, there'll be a similar impetus and stimulus from the festival there of those particular events. When we're thinking about sustainability from a financial perspective, some research that we are working on at the moment looks at how sustainable and financially sustainable women's sport can be, and again focusing on football, and where there is professionalisation, where there is starting to be more money involved with your on-field performance, regulations from governing bodies really do need to be in place to ensure that those organisations within their sport run in a financially sustainable way. And then, of course, whilst juggling the economic impact with social and ethical responsibilities, sustained investment here is so crucial to the momentum for women's sport. But this requires women's sport to be viewed as core business, not as a corporate social responsibility and part of goodwill. It's part of the core business that they do. And I think something that will obviously help with exploring the impact of the pandemic is the commission of research to do that, because that will help to provide insights into potential solutions. There's a relatively small group of researchers working in this particular area. And so the more that we're able to make that link with practitioners and to share our research, the better. So I'm grateful for Raf for inviting me today. What I'm going to do now is put some links in the chat for you if you want to go away and look at any of this research in a bit more depth. 2 of the studies have been published. We've got another 2 in the process. And I was going to put a link to something else. So there'll be 2 links, and I can't remember what the second one is, but you'll see that in a sec. Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Beth. Really, really interesting research that you've just presented to us, and look forward to seeing the links. So let's move swiftly on to our next speaker. Leigh Thompson. Leigh is the head of policy at the Sport and Recreation Alliance and oversees the organisation's work across a broad spectrum of public policy. He has primary responsibility for areas including sports integrity, broadcasting, tax and regulatory policy, and EU/Brexit. He has a background in policy and regulation, having held similar posts in other sectors prior to joining the Alliance. Over to you, Leigh. Thanks very much.
Raf, and thank you very much for the invite today. So I'm delighted to be here. I'll see if I can share my screen. Hopefully this works. Hopefully people can see that. Okay,
yeah,
cool.
That's great.
Yeah, so I just want to spend a bit of time talking through some research we've done with Sheffield Hallam University, which was primarily designed to look at the impact of COVID-19 on grassroots sport and also the kind of resilience of the grassroots bit of the sector emerging from the pandemic. But before I kind of get into the detail, just a short word on the Alliance for people who perhaps don't know the organisation that well. We are the membership body that represents over 300 organisations from across the sport and recreation sector. So we have organisations in membership, everyone from the largest governing bodies like the FA, RFU, ECB, right through to very small governing bodies. We have active partnerships and also sport for development charities and many other local and regional sports organisations. So a very diverse and broad membership, which certainly makes policy work interesting, but also quite challenging at times. So that's broadly the Alliance in a nutshell. So sort of turning to the research that we've undertaken, the kind of key objective really was in the latter part of 2020, it was quite clear that we needed to have some better knowledge about the impact of the pandemic on grassroots sport, particularly voluntary clubs, but also to get some understanding of the view of that bit of the sector in terms of how it might be able to survive and recover from the pandemic. So in undertaking this research, we partnered with Sheffield Hallam University Sport Industry Research Centre, which I'm sure many of the people on this call will know, very well known university and a lot of expertise in this area. And we ran a short online survey from February to March of this year to gather the data. And in very broad terms, we asked a series of backward and forward looking questions. So looking back at what happened during the lockdowns in 2020 and also the early part of 21, and also asking a series of questions about how organisations in the grassroots part of the sector viewed coming out of the pandemic and their long-term resilience. So just briefly how we did it, it was all done online. We had a very tight turnaround in terms of trying to get the data in and analysed. And so we had actually a pretty good response rate considering the turnaround time. So we had over 1,400 responses and quite a good breakdown of responses across different sports and activities. So we had over 27 sports and activities with over 30 respondents. So quite a good kind of sample and good mix of sports and activities responding. I should also say most of the responses came from what we kind of typically class as traditional grassroots sports clubs affiliated to governing bodies, but we also did have responses from a range of other organisations like sport for development charities, individuals and for-profit organisations that are providing grassroots sport opportunities. So just in terms of some of the key findings, I won't go through all of these in detail, but just to pick out a couple, I guess a key one from the membership perspective is a substantial drop in the membership during lockdown, which is probably not surprising. So 60% drop in membership of clubs, and that was forecast to recover to 76% of pre-COVID levels. And I'll touch on some of the things that came out of the analysis in a little while. In terms of the workforce, on the paid staff side, again, a substantial reduction in paid staff as a result of lockdowns. Again, not a huge surprise, but that's forecast to bounce back quite strongly to almost where we were pre-pandemic. Although a big kind of finding that came through very strongly was that around a third of clubs think they will lose coaches. So on the paid coaches side, there was a big concern there. And then just looking at the kind of financial side, clearly income has fallen quite substantially again, but clubs have shown that they've been able to reduce outgoings as well. So perhaps the damage is not quite as bad as we first thought early on in the pandemic, though clearly a number of clubs have had to kind of dig into reserves to support their activities during lockdown, and also the government's support through the various COVID support grants. Business rate relief has also been accessed by quite a substantial number of clubs and organisations in the grassroots sector. So slightly more of a nuanced picture on the finances side. And then just looking at volunteers, perhaps slightly more positively, we see quite a substantial number of volunteers in administrative and facility management roles who were still active during lockdown. I guess that's primarily due to the fact that a lot of the administration can continue remotely, but also I think there was an exemption for facility maintenance, so people could go in and maintain club facilities during certain parts of the lockdown. And also going forward, clubs are forecasting that there'll be greater pressure on volunteers and more time needed to get the clubs back to where they were pre-COVID. So those are kind of the real snapshot of the key findings. So after a bit of further analysis, we kind of came out with about 4 key headline conclusions. So the sector, I think when we first went into the research, we were slightly concerned about how resilient the grassroots bit of the sector would be. And I think perhaps one of the more pleasing kind of outcomes of the research is showing that there's been quite a high degree of resilience. So when asked about their kind of views of the future, over 81% of respondents agreed that their organisation has the resilience to survive COVID-19. So there's quite a lot of positivity around the sector despite the challenges. And as I've said before, over 75% of volunteers were kind of stayed at the helm during the lockdown. So I think that shows there's a lot of resilience in the volunteer part of the sector. I think the second kind of key conclusion is that there has and will continue to be a substantial impact on children and young people and their participation in organised activity. So we did see that in terms of membership, clubs projected that they would have almost 30% fewer junior members post-pandemic. Now, clearly, that's a projection at this point. That's a forecast of those clubs, and it may or may not come to pass, and very much hope it doesn't. But I think that just goes to show the challenge that the grassroots part of the sector faces in terms of getting young people back into organised sport. That will continue to be a challenge, and I think that will be exacerbated somewhat by the challenges around ensuring that we have an adequate supply of skilled coaches and other volunteers to get sessions on. I think the third key conclusion is clearly, and again, not a surprise, but access to facilities and volunteers are going to be crucial to reinstating activity opportunities for everyone. So a fairly clear message that came through in the research was that the availability of leisure centres and schools in particular was a key barrier to getting back to activity for clubs. And again, as I've mentioned, the availability of skilled, good coaches is also going to be critical. That was one of the most commonly cited barriers to returning to activity. So there's a big challenge there. And then lastly, again, perhaps slightly positively, clearly there's been a significant financial impact, and everyone is in a worse position than they were before, but perhaps not in a critical position, although I would kind of caveat that by the fact that different clubs have faced different challenges. So what we did see was facility owning clubs, so you might expect, have property costs that are ongoing, therefore they've had to take a sort of bigger financial hit than those organisations that perhaps don't need facilities to run their activities. So it does differ by the type of club and the location. So in terms of the implications of what does this all kind of mean in terms of coming back from COVID and long-term resilience, I think one of the things the research is showing that there is clearly a huge number of interdependencies between facilities, clubs, and the workforce in being able to restart the system. So, put bluntly, clubs, in order to put on opportunities to retain and attract participants, will need access to both facilities and coaches. And the extent to which we're unable to access those facilities and coaches is going to have a big bearing on being able to get people back active. I think another thing that's a slightly more worrying implication, again, is that we could be looking at a substantial mental health challenge for the sector, both on the participant side. So one of the key messages that came through in the survey responses was that one of the biggest impacts of lockdown on participants was on their mental health. So there's I think a big challenge for the sector there in terms of the mental health of participants, but also I think the pressure on volunteers and also coaches, many of whom may already be lost to the sector, unfortunately. There will be a substantial challenge for those providing physical activity opportunities. So something to think about there. I think another implication that came through from the research is that some of the challenges that are most acute are in the most deprived and diverse communities. And I think this chimes with some of the comments that are made by previous speakers. That, and again, this is not necessarily a huge surprise. We see this in wider impacts of COVID. But one of the things that came through in the research was that clubs that were serving more diverse communities in particular face bigger financial challenges in terms of getting back on their feet. But also they cited access to school facilities as one of the biggest challenges for them. So I think that may be a challenge that persists in those areas, which needs to be thought through. Another implication we've seen is that the impact of lockdown may have accelerated some pre-existing trends in participation. So away from more organised sports, so team sports, towards what we might loosely call lifestyle-based activities. So things that are more flexible and fit around people's lives. So things like running, walking, cycling, and that has been sort of borne out, I guess, in other research that's out there. The Active Lives survey seems to show a bit of an uptick in those kinds of activities versus more organised sports. So there is potentially a challenge there around the mix of participation changing over time, and that would have impacts on the mix of clubs ultimately. And then lastly, clearly, to the extent that the sector is permanently scarred, and which may or may not be the case, then there may well be the potential that there is a reduction in the social return the sector delivers. So again, I'm sure many on this call know Sheffield Hallam did a big piece of work for Sport England looking at social return on investment delivered by the sector, and clearly there may well be an impact on that to the extent that capacity and capability in the sector is damaged by COVID. So just sort of looking at things from a slightly broader perspective, I guess from the positive side, if you can call it that, I guess what the research shows is that it's chiming with a lot of the wider policy challenges that we're seeing in the sector. But I say positive in a kind of ironic sense. It's not positive in that these are quite worrying challenges for the sector to address along with government and other policymakers. So clearly, when we talk about facilities, there is an enormous pressure on particularly public leisure facilities. A number of them are already closed, and there is a likelihood that more will go unless more resources are put in to kind of provide short-term support and stability. But clearly that, as I've mentioned before, in terms of interdependencies, has an impact on, in particular, indoor sports who are reliant on public leisure facilities in particular. So sports like netball, volleyball, badminton and swimming are fundamentally reliant on these assets. And so if we lose them, then there is a huge challenge there for the grassroots of those sports in particular. I think even beyond the short term, there is a series of challenges around the position of public leisure facilities. So clearly we have an ageing public leisure stock already, and which is badly in need of kind of refurbishment and renewal. So even pre-pandemic, this was the case. So I think that's a challenge, but it equally does present potentially an opportunity in terms of the refurbishment and renewal, because we know that these are quite expensive sites to run, and also my understanding is that they do contribute to quite quite a lot of local authority emissions. So there is potentially an opportunity there to kind of reimagine public leisure facilities and actually take cost out and also emissions. So from an environmental point of view, I think there's an opportunity there. And then also just touch on sort of the challenges around children and young people. I've highlighted there the position with respect to the PE and sport premium, which has now actually been confirmed for the next academic year, but only in the last few weeks. But I think that just points to the challenges the sector faces in terms of getting enough focus and resource to address the challenges we've got in terms of getting children maintaining their activity levels, but also getting more children active over the long term. And then finally, just to flag, I guess all of this is set against a context where the public finances are likely to be challenging over the longer term. So although there's been substantial support provided through COVID-19, I think the spending review, which is due in the autumn, is likely still to be quite a challenging environment for sport and local government in particular. So we are going to continue to have to operate in a very constrained environment. But I'll leave it there. Those are kind of just some of the broader kind of challenges that I think we see in the sector, but happy to take questions as part of the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Leigh. So I'll just invite all of our speakers to come back into the discussion. I haven't seen any questions come up in the chat. So I'll just say, again, do please type questions in the chat. And also, if you want to, then feel free to raise your hand. And I will do my best to track that as well. I will start off with a question for all of our speakers, which is, and I think a few of you have kind of touched on this, but maybe kind of if you could expand, that would be great. Obviously, a lot of what you've talked about has focused around kind of the real challenge and the negative impact of COVID that it has caused on the sector in these numerous different areas, be that environmental, be that about kind of the social aspect, women's sport, financial challenges. What opportunities, or maybe what is the kind of the biggest opportunity you think that COVID represents in terms of, is there any way of putting a positive spin on everything that the world has been through over the last 18 months or so? I don't know if any of you would like to take that first.
Yeah, I think there is a positive. I mean, one of the questions that we asked in our survey was, do you see this as an opportunity? And the sector overwhelmingly did come back and say this has to be an opportunity. And I emphasize the words that did come out of that even people were saying this is a necessity. We've got to do something, and this is such a big change that it must also represent an opportunity. Now, having heard both of my co-presenters speak as well, there's clearly an issue. From my perspective, we emphasize the environmental sustainability. And look, the conversation that we've already had just demonstrates how the breadth of this term sustainability anyway. But my focus is primarily around the environmental side. And there is such a greater awareness now, and I've seen this increasing over a number of years. BASIS has been in existence for 10 years. Our 10th anniversary is coming up in October. And it's been a struggle at times to actually get people to engage, particularly around environmental issues and sport. It's considered as something that is, yeah, it's interesting, it's happening somewhere else, but it doesn't actually impact on me directly. And we're increasingly seeing sports being impacted, particularly by climate change. That's where it's obvious. But there's the breadth of issues, sustainability issues that there are, and how they're all interconnected, really do come together to impact sport in quite a unique way. And the potential power of sport is because it brings together so many elements. If we're just looking at professional sports, you've got, a major venue will have, they'll be using cleaning chemicals. They will have contracts for catering. So all the way down the food supply chain, there's going to be impacts of weather, impacts in terms of nutrition for the athletes. All these things build up, and sport is a real nexus for where these all focus. So for me, COVID has been one issue, and there have been numerous sort of cartoons and comments around, you know, there's the COVID wave is nothing compared to what's coming in terms of climate change. I think that the bigger challenges are coming to us, but now is an opportunity to actually say, we've got to change some things. There will be competing issues here, clearly. I think Leigh has just demonstrated, and some of the financial impacts. A lot of clubs are going to be hurting from a financial perspective, and are just going to say, I don't have the capacity. I might have the will, I might have the desire, but I just don't have the capacity to actually look at the environment. So from a basis perspective, we're probably looking at things either not changing or possibly getting slightly worse from an environmental performance. But the will is there, and after maybe a year to 18 months, there's going to be a bounce back, and sport and sustainability, environmental sustainability, is really going to respond. And I think there will be positives coming out of it.
Thanks, Russ. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I'll just add, I mean, echo what Russ has just said, but I guess one thing I think has come clear in the pandemic, I guess, is these sectors has shown quite an admirable ability to kind of adapt and change very quickly in response to changing circumstances. So I think there is a real positive there about the sector's kind of flexibility and resilience. And so I think there is an opportunity, if we can kind of maintain that mindset, that we can actually achieve quite substantial changes and make a difference if we're able to continue to innovate and change. I think from a policy point of view, there is certainly is a kind of reset moment feeling whereby we can and should be looking to do things differently. And I think Sport England's new strategy is kind of certainly pointing towards where that might be. I think the challenge now, I guess, is for us as a sector to engage with the kind of policymakers and get them to see that this is the time to start looking at radically kind of reshaping bits of sort of sports policy. Whether there's an appetite for that remains to be seen, but it does feel like it's kind of the time is now if we were ever to do things differently.
Right, Beth?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think without wanting to rehash a few of the points that I raised earlier, I think in addition, I think another opportunity, or perhaps something to look at positively, is the way that journalists have reported on women's sports over the last year or so. We're past that now, aren't we? We've got a piece of research coming out that Keith Parry at Bournemouth has led, that I've been involved in, that looks at and analyses the reports about women's football since the pandemic. And what we really saw, which was great, was a diversity in reporting, which in terms of the journalists who were reporting, but also in the length of articles, also in the critique of the position that women's sport, in this case football, was in within general football culture as well. So I think that the media interest is obviously going to be crucial moving forward. There's also opportunities to drive commercial revenue. That's an exciting area that's to be developed in women's sport, especially. Some clubs are reliant on that, 80% of their income roughly, if we were to take Man City for an example, on commercial revenue. So further opportunities to be able to do that. And in the context of football, for instance, you know, advertising in women's football is a fairly cheap and less costly way of trying to get your product or your brand out there. So it's in COVID, where there is reduced money available across all companies and financial sort of hits across the society, then that is an opportunity for the sport to push themselves forward and say, hey, we've got broadcasting deals coming in, we've got all this chance to reach a wide audience, and we don't cost as much perhaps as the men's football. So I think there's a real opportunity there, just to highlight one example.
Great, thanks everyone. Something else that I picked up on that a few of you mentioned as well was about kind of the role of volunteers in this recovery from COVID, which seems to be a sort of recurring theme and something that's absolutely crucial. So I wondered if each of you could speak a bit more about that. Russ, I'm sort of interested in the work that you do with BASIS and how important you think that the voluntary sector is going to be kind of going forward in terms of making those crucial sort of implementing the recommendations that you were talking about in the white paper. So perhaps you could take that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think my background is in professional sports, and we've got others within BASIS who work very much more with sort of recreational and grassroots. But the biggest, there's always the brand impact of working with the major venues and the bigger sporting venues. But I've always understood that the real impact that an organisation like BASIS can make is actually going out to the huge numbers of people that actually play sport, and those are the people that are linked to the recreational game. And most of our recreational sport is led by volunteers, is led by people that are passionate about what they're doing. So absolutely, the volunteers will be engaged in this and will be driving these things forward. In terms of a formal approach for volunteers from a environmental sustainability angle in particular, they're going to want to get their clubs back and running first. Is always going to be the priority here, absolutely. But I genuinely think there's such an awareness around environmental issues now that so many are going to just say, look, let's do things differently. We're looking at how we reorganize ourselves. And a lot of environmental sustainability from a practical perspective is about efficiency. You know, sometimes we can just equate to keep things simple, and I really try and keep, there's such an issue around sustainability that it's this big complex, you know, you need to understand lots of science, and it's going to be really, really difficult. Get the principles simple. Sustainability can almost directly equate to efficiency in some cases, and efficiency equates to lower costs. So there are certain things. So that's going to be an education piece, and trying to get that information out to volunteers. And we're starting to reach out now. We've recently done a video for volunteers. I think it was the Birmingham County FA contacted us, and we just did a 20-minute piece that they can show to their volunteers they're coming back, just explaining some of the principles of sustainability and some of the things that can be done. So, I mean, we could probably share that video with others. You know, it wasn't great production values, to be perfectly honest. It was me on a Zoom call being interviewed by another member of BASIS, just talking about what these principles could be. But volunteers are crucial in all aspects of sport, and volunteers are going to be crucial in how sport responds to the COVID pandemic across the board, including environmental sustainability issues.
Great, thanks, Ross. And that kind of relates to what you were saying, Leigh, in a way, doesn't it? In that there is going to be this enormous pressure on volunteers as we kind of come out of COVID. Do you think that that's a concern? Are we in danger of giving volunteers, or sort of overloading volunteers with things to do?
That's always one of my concerns, that we're overloading volunteers. But I think it's certainly true. I mean, for sure, it came through in the research we've done, which is that both showing just how important volunteers have been in kind of stabilising the ship and actually keeping it running, but also the pressure they're under and the pressure they're projected to be under going forward to keep things moving and grow beyond kind of COVID. I think one of the kind of key things we continually push when we are talking to policymakers is to remind them that fundamentally grassroots sport is run by volunteers, and so policy changes need to kind of always have that at the front of their mind, which is that, you know, this is going to have an impact on the ground, and, you know, real people in volunteer roles are going to have to make this work. So I do think we have a sort of broader challenge across the sector in terms of looking at how we both look after the current volunteers we've got, but also so we retain them and look after them, but also we attract new volunteers from a more diverse background. So, because I think most people would know the current volunteer base is probably not as diverse as it could be, but also B, that we're attracting people with the right skills. So increasingly, I think we're going to be in an environment where, I think this is already the case now, but it will be increasingly, running a grassroots sports club is actually quite a complex thing to do. You need to have lots of people with the right skills in terms of tax and finances. Increasingly, they might need to understand more complex guidance around environment and climate change if there are requirements there. A whole range of areas. I mean, we do a lot of work on the tax side of things in relation to grassroots sport, and the changes in the last few years are incredibly complex, and so we do need to understand the kinds of skills we need to keep these clubs growing and thriving.
Yeah, really important. And I suppose that relates to what Russ was saying about some of the kind of work that they've been doing at Basis with some of these volunteers. Beth, I guess traditionally women's sport has relied very heavily on volunteers. Have you seen an impact on that during COVID? Has any of your research or any other research kind of considered that, do you think?
I think it should be an area to consider. I think the fundamental issue we have is the number of researchers who are passionate about this research and want to do more. And I think more and more support we're seeing from academic associations, interest from industry as well in women's sport really shows that there's opportunities to do more work, greater understanding, provide more insights into difficulties. I think just on women's sport, while Leigh and Russ were just talking, it made me think about there are a lot of issues fundamentally with running competitions, leagues, etc., with volunteers. But I also sort of, again, thinking back to your last question about opportunities, thought back to being games maker, and I'm sure there are other people on this call who might have been as well. And I think with some of the key flagship events that will be in England in women's sport over the next few years, I think that's a great way to be able to encourage more to get involved in the sports. We've seen that with the Euros this year, where they've been doing a similar type of arrangement, and there's certainly plans to do that with the women's Euros next year, and they've done that in some other sports. But I think that's a real opportunity to get volunteers involved. People want to be involved in mega events, and I suppose maybe the challenge is, of course, with more grassroots sport. But I was just thinking about that as an opportunity, perhaps, for women's sport.
Great, thanks, Beth. So we've obviously got in the room, we've got both academics and kind of practitioners. Just trying to kind of bring those two sectors together. I'm going to start with Russ and Leigh. What one thing do you think that we as academics could be doing to kind of, I suppose, to try and overcome some of these challenges that we're seeing with COVID? Do you think that kind of as sports academics, there are things that we can be doing better, that we can be doing differently, that we can be doing to help the sector? And then I'm going to turn that question on its head in a minute and ask it to Beth about what the sector could be doing to help us as academics. But yeah, I might start with Russ.
Yeah, I mean, I was an academic for many years, and as you said in my introduction, I kind of took a leap sideways and got into sport management through a very odd, I won't go into it now, but it was, I had no intention of ever turning up in sport, and here I am, having running Basis, my two passions. So I'll say this in terms of the perception from the sports sector. It's not necessarily my opinion, but I think there is a perception that the academia and academics, and apologies if anybody's offended, it's a bit of an ivory tower, and it's something quite separate to the practical management of sport. So I think the key thing, and one thing that Basis really wants to do is to, and actually I've been intending for a long time to set up a kind of a subcommittee of academics. So if anybody on this call is keen to be involved, let me know. But we need to bridge that gap. There is so much quality information, and quality is an absolutely key word in that. That is what academic discipline brings, is that ability to generate a research question and generate quality information around it. But we've then got to translate that into the practicalities. So I guess that's probably quite a general answer. Clearly that's a desirable thing at any point. But when you need information, I think identifying some key research areas that are practical, and then being able to communicate that into the sector in an understandable way, and genuinely that's something that I'm passionate that BASIS can do, is to assist in that translation of the academic research to that really practical applied knowledge that we can give to the operational managers.
Yeah, brilliant. And as you say, that's great that you've kind of, to some extent, got a little bit of a foot in both camps there, so you understand where both sides are coming from. I think that's a brilliant idea about setting up the subcommittee. Obviously, some of us at Bournemouth will be really keen to be involved in that, and I'm sure that there are others on the call who would be as well. Leigh, did you want to kind of come in on that?
Yeah, I was just scribbling while Russ was talking. I guess what I wrote down was, I think the challenge here is how you connect really deep academic expertise to decision makers at the kind of sharp end, and how you do that in the right way and at the right time. So for me as a practitioner, it's about having research or evidence that is available in a format that can be understood and digested by decision makers, and is clear in what it's saying, so that when you do go to decision making, you say, this is the evidence we've got, this is what it's telling us, this is what you need to do. So it's really just simplifying, and as best as possible try, I guess, and I think this is probably a more difficult challenge, is trying to align research timescales to sort of fit with policy timescales, which often are shorter than academic timescales, and often quite unpredictable. So having a bit more flexibility and adaptability around being able to maybe just do really quick pieces of research that just meet an immediate need. But again, I would also lay the charge at us as at the practitioner end, that we need to be better at engaging with academics and the research that's out there. So I hold my hands up.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. You're absolutely right that sometimes we can take too long to do things, and obviously the sector needs the findings sometimes more quickly than they might traditionally have been available. I suppose the research that you did with Sheffield Hallam is a really good example of a piece of research that you were able to kind of collaborate on, that actually kind of did what you needed it to in the timescale that you needed it to.
Yeah, definitely. That was very much the kind of push, was we needed something really quick. So we had to sort of accept probably that if we had, this is going to be done in a way that would be different if we had, 12 months to do it. But as long as we can get some kind of key findings to understand the impact quickly, that's more valuable than having a perfect survey that is kind of, piloted and takes 12 to 18 months. So for sure, I would agree with that.
Great, thank you. And Beth, I will come to you now as the kind of the academic in the room, one of the academics in the room. Do you think that there are, how do you see this kind of relationship from an academic perspective in terms of working with the sector?
I think certainly in the past sort of 2 years, I suppose, since the pandemic, and perhaps not related to that, but I'm just thinking the last couple of years, I've found that there's a great level of interest, desire to do more work around gender equality in organisations. We're going to be working with 2 national governing bodies who are interested in some form of advancement of gender equality in whatever aspect for them that's important at the moment. So in that respect, that's been great. I think that as academics, we have the ability to have a platform to be advocates, to speak for people whose voices might not be heard otherwise, through our research and through our findings as well. And so I would say it's an academic's responsibility to make the most out of that platform, to be on Twitter, to speak with the media, to get these individuals' voices heard who might be underrepresented in that particular sport, or to uncover potential issues or areas for improvement that perhaps have been overlooked or perhaps require further attention and improvement. And I think if you're able to do that, if you're able to chat on these types of calls and potentially connect with people that you wouldn't have done so otherwise, then I think it's conversations. And just by having those conversations, we all kind of need to be open to those conversations as well, I think. so that it's not an us-them. I think it's a careful balance. Just to pick up on Leigh's point, I think universities could do more. I know universities can sometimes charge more if there's no research output associated with the particular project, and so that's not attractive to an industry partner, but equally that sort of collaboration between the two might take a bit longer in order to get to be able to tick that sort of research output box for the academics, and therefore make it a more affordable proposition for industry partners as well. So for me it's conversations, not being afraid to put yourself out there and being told, no, we're not interested in that, either from an industry or an academic point of view.
Great, thanks, Beth. And hopefully, I guess one of the purposes of today's event was to try and maybe kickstart some of those conversations. And I'm certainly finding this really interesting. And I'd like to thank all three of you really for being here today and for kind of, being open to those conversations, I suppose. We're almost out of time, so I might just wrap up with a kind of final question, if all three of you wouldn't mind just thinking briefly about this, because it's quite a big question in a way, but we're thinking about kind of short term emerging from COVID and those challenges. What's your vision for how you hope that sport in the UK and globally, if you want to expand that vision, might look like in, say, 5 or 10 years' time? Again, it's a big question, and I have slightly sprung it on you to some extent, but perhaps you could just kind of briefly reflect on that. Russ, do you mind if I come to you first?
No, but I'm just going to pause for a second to think of it. It is a big question. Yeah. From an environmental perspective, sport is going to be impacted by some of these issues. Climate change is the obvious one. We're already looking at, extreme heat affecting, there's a report on the BASIS website about potential impacts for the Tokyo Olympics, which is, now it's only a couple of weeks away. But if there's extreme heat events there, how athletes should be adapting. I think there'll be an increasing realization of the environmental impacts that are hitting sport and how they impact sport. I think one key thing to emphasize in all of this from an environmental perspective is that sport isn't alone in this. There's no way that sport is going to be able to solve issues around this, but sport can communicate those issues and can really be, there's a real opportunity for sport to talk about these issues and get it out to a very broad audience and put it into that context and make it real for people. Those volunteers that we're talking about, those participants that we're talking about, if they start to understand that actually this is going to impact the thing that I love, the thing that I'm passionate about, there could then be other changes. So I think that maybe there's going to be a bigger integration between sport and these risks that it's facing, but society in general is changing. So it's not, sport isn't in isolation in this. And it's one of the things that we're often getting asked about is that, well, how do we actually respond to this? There's so much for us to do, and it's every element of society is going to be changing over the next few years. There could be real profound changes coming out of COP26, the climate change talks in November. So we're absolutely not alone, but I think sport certainly in maybe 30 years time is probably going to be quite different. But even within the next 5, the timescale you've just asked, 5, 6, maybe 10 years, there's going to be changes. There's going to be adaptations, possibly to rules and regulations, more drinks breaks because of heat or whatever. But yeah, not necessarily a direct answer, but there will be changes, but difficult to predict what they might actually be.
I think that was a really important answer, actually. Makes us realise how important it is to be taking action immediately, I suppose. Leigh, can I come to you now?
Yeah, again, I've been scribbling down because I was desperately trying to think of an answer to a very complex question. But I think your question was, where would I see the sector, where sport and activity in 5 years? I guess my answer is kind of where I'd like it to be rather than where it might be. But I guess, put simply, I would like us to be in a situation where sport, recreation, physical activity is more central to everyone's daily life. And I think I cast my mind back to the very first lockdown. If there was any positive in it, it was, I guess, the simplicity of the daily routine and the centrality of going out for a walk or a run in the time you could go out. And I think for once, sort of everyone, or almost everyone, kind of experienced that. And I think if we could kind of capture that in some way and take it forward, then we would be in a better place. But I think for us to be able to get to that point, we need to take a lot of action in a lot of different areas. And so that will be everything from pushing further on the impacts of climate change, promoting women's sport much more aggressively than we are at the moment. And also it's going to need concerted action from not just the sector, but also government, business, civil society. So it's going to require a lot of coordinated effort across a lot of areas, but it's possible. It's just kind of the will, I guess.
Great answer. Thanks so much. And finally to you, Beth.
Just to build on what Leigh said there, my answer is really one word, and that's momentum. And building on momentum, or flip it the other way, not losing momentum either. So I think that would be my very short, sweet answer based on building on what Leigh and Russ have said.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you to all three of our speakers. Thank you to everyone for coming.